Okay, good morning. Today I'm going to talk about representations of the people of early Sydney, because this week we're looking at early Sydney and culture contact in those first few years with the British and the Eora. And I think the issue of representations is particularly important. So I want to talk about the ways in which Aboriginal people were imagined by the first Europeans and the sort of ideas that went into that imagining and how that sort of affected outcomes. So I've chosen the title From Eora to Aborigines to show that in fact through representations by outsiders, the Eora became known to the world not as Eora but as Aborigines or natives. Now I just want to talk about the concept of cultural baggage. Cultural baggage is a term that could mean to refer to imported ideas and preconceptions. And of course, it's natural and inevitable that people will come with ideas in their head. They're not empty vessels, they will come with their preconditions from their European world. And these preconceptions can become extremely powerful and they can shape actions. So they can shape actions and words on the frontier. And in fact, expectations can even override the evidence. And I'll give you an example of that. Because we've talked about Captain Cook in recent lectures about his possessing of the country and about him being one of the most important and early observers of Aboriginal Australia for the British. And Cook, when he was up on the Great Barrier Reef, his ship was on its side, it was being refitted because a great gaping hole had been torn in the side of the ship by the coral reef. Cook did have some meetings with Aboriginal people and he started to do some reflective writing, and he wrote this piece. He said, "From what I have seen of the natives of New Holland, they may appear to some to be the most wretched people upon earth. But in reality, they are far more happier than we Europeans, being wholly unacquainted not only with the superfluous, but with the necessary conveniences so much sought after in Europe. They are happy in not knowing the use of them. They live in a tranquillity which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition. The earth and sea of their own accord furnishes them with all the things necessary for life. They covet not magnificent houses, household stuff, etc. They live in a warm and fine climate and enjoy every wholesome air, so that they seem to be fully sensible of, for many to whom we have clothed, etc., left it carelessly upon the sea beach and in the woods, as a thing they had no manner of use for. In short, they seem to set no value upon anything, nor not their own, nor any other article we could offer them. This, in my opinion, argues that they think themselves provided with all necessities of life and that they have no superfluities." So this was quite an amazing statement by Cook, that in fact Aboriginal people were far more happier than we Europeans, that they didn't covet all the things that Europeans did, all the material goods, the fine houses, etc., and that they were in fact totally satisfied with life. Now, it was an amazing statement, and it was so amazing that a man called Hawkesworth, who actually edited Cook's voyages and the journals of the voyages, thought that this was total rubbish. He thought it didn't accord with what he understood back in England, sitting in his armchair, Aboriginal people to be from the other accounts that he'd read. So what he did, being a good editor, he didn't chuck it right out, but he shifted it from Cook's account of the Aboriginal people of Australia to his account of the Terra del Fuegans in lower South America. So the Terra del Fuegans are described by this passage that was actually meant to be attached to the descriptions of Aboriginal people. So you can see that Hawkesworth's preconceptions about Aborigines had been so strong that he edited that piece and shifted it from one people to another. And this wasn't restored in Cook's journals till 100 years later. So the world never knew that for 100 years that Cook had attached this fine statement to his view of Aboriginal people. So this is to show you how expectations can override the evidence, what people are seeing before them or what they're presented even by the great navigator to edit. I want to talk about now David Collins' perspective. Lieutenant David Collins published one of the first fleet accounts of early Sydney. There are about 4 or 5 of them. And in that he showed particular interest in Aboriginal people and their culture and what they were doing. And so he wrote about their hunting-gathering and also the rituals he observed. I showed you a slide last time of an initiation that was in Collins' account. And here we have a funeral and people burning a body in cremation. Now, he used this image that was drawn by the convict artist Thomas Watling. So Collins is quite interested in Aboriginal people, writes a lot about them, but he makes this extraordinary statement. He says, "No country has yet been discovered without a religion, but the Aborigines are an exception to that." So why does he say this? He's seeing initiations, he's seeing funeral ceremonies, and yet he says these people are the first people in the world without a religion. In fact, from what we know of the relationship to the land that we were discussing last week, it's quite the opposite. They are among the most deeply religious and spiritual people in the world. So how did he miss it out? Why was this so? And I suggest it's the prison of his own ethnocentrism. His own European worldview, his British worldview, his cultural baggage of ideas he brings with him is so strong that he cannot see the evidence before him, that he's a prisoner of this ethnocentric view of the world. And the word ethnocentrism comes from 2 Latin words, ethnos, meaning people, and centrum, the centre. So it's nation-centred. It's a British worldview that he's being trapped by. So if we're thinking about the power of this cultural baggage to shape ideas and actions, to have the evidence overlooked, what sort of ideas are we going to encounter? Well, firstly, the British came with binary thinking, which is common to the way most of us think about the world. And there were probably about 5 other key ideas they had in their head. One of them was the notion of savagery, both noble and ignoble, the idea of social developmentalism, ideas of colour and their meanings, the scientific worldview, and finally, the rights of Englishmen. So I want to talk about these one by one. But first, just to talk briefly about binary thinking. Binary comes from the Latin word binarius, meaning 2 together. And binary thinking is usually in terms of opposites, as I've given the example on the PowerPoint, good and evil, young and old, tall and short. We tend to think of the world in these binary terms. They're very easy for us to imagine the world in this way. Perhaps makes it very black and white, and that's another binary, but that's the way people often think. And binaries are used in people's definition of themselves. You know, there is the notion of us and them out there as being different. And I had read to you earlier Rudyard Kipling's poem, We and They, which talked about the binary of we and they, but also whether there could be a transgression across that boundary, and we could start to think about how they are looking at we. So that we need to always remember that binaries were underlying much of the thinking of the Europeans that arrived in Australia. Now, the idea of savagery was important, but there were 2 sorts of savages in 18th century thinking. There was the noble savage and the ignoble savage. So let's start with the ignoble savage. The word savage comes from the Latin word salvaticus, meaning wood. And it's actually very instructive to go back to the historical dictionaries, the very fat Oxford dictionaries that give you all the historical origins of words, because they're often very revealing as to where words come from and their meanings. So Salvaticus meant a wood, and of course woods in the Roman and Greek imagination were places of danger, of chaos, places to be avoided. And so the word Salvaticus gets translated in English to savage, which within a couple of centuries starts to take on added meanings. It's the meanings of a fierce people, a people of the lowest culture, a people who are heathen, who are living in chaos. And of course it's posed in the binary way with the word civicus, which is the word for citizen, the Latin word for citizen, and out of that came the word civilised. So you can see how, you know, the notion of the dangerous wood came to be attached to the savage. And this was certainly a very old idea in Western thought. The Greeks, who lived in city-states and in a controlled world, had a fear of woods and mountains, and that's where the gods lived, that were often quite rampant in their behaviour, couldn't be controlled. And of course the Romans also had a view of the woods as being very dangerous places, because that's, for instance, where in Germanicus the Germans tribes lived, who in the end defeated Rome in one of the great battles of the Roman Empire, where 2 legions were wiped out in a forest where they were ambushed and trapped. So the Romans, the Greeks, had a very antipathetic view of forests, of woods. They were associated with cases of chaos and lack of control. And here again, I think I've shown you this image, Orson bringing in a wild man, and here you've got civilization trying to control and tame the savage. So it's really very much part of the European identity. But there were also, in the 18th century, the idea that there were noble savages. And this was a mid to late 18th century idea. And it stemmed from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a Frenchman who lived a fairly wayward youth, travelling around an itinerant life until he then settled down in Paris and started to write philosophical tracts. And one of them was called Discourse on Arts and Sciences, written around about 1760. And in that essay, he attacked the artificiality of the French court, its effeteness and its corruptness. And he argued, as civilization, as arts and sciences develop, moral virtue declines. So there was an inverse proportion of morality and civilization. And he proposed that true virtue was found in natural man living in a natural surroundings, and that person acted through what he called natural reason. So truth and virtue were found in the natural world, not in the civilized world or the salons of Paris. It was rather a sort of ambiguous stance to take, because Rousseau became part of that intellectual salon world of Paris while also rejecting it. And he wrote a great deal about education. He was one of the foremost thinkers of the Enlightened period, placing an importance on education as a shaping tool. It was strange, though, that he allowed his own children to run wild and then basically walked out on them and left them in a foundlings' home. So Rousseau's ideas become extremely influential, partly there to do with the growth of Romanticism. You know, that man in the natural world, away from the sort of hubble and bubble of cities, away from the sort of corruptness of city life, natural man is most virtuous. And I think it was part of the Romantic imagination of exotic places, the places out in the wilds, the wilderness. And of course, by this time, the Pacific had been found by Europe, and the Pacific took on a very important place in the European imagination as something exotic, something that was perhaps attainable to reach higher stages of life and perfection. Now, not everyone was convinced by Rousseau. You see in an image a great debate going on in one of the coffee houses of Europe, perhaps in Paris, the salons where intellectual discussion took place by people of leisure. Here you see them in their wiggery. So these are the people that Rousseau was saying had become corrupted by their effete city life of upper-class gentlemen, and yet here they are also the ones debating his ideas. But not everyone was convinced, like the famous Dr. Johnson of London debated the noble savage with Boswell, and at one part of their exchange he said, "Boswell, I do not think the people of Tahiti can be reckoned savages." Johnson, "They don't cant in defence of savages." Boswell, "They have the art of navigation." Johnson, "A dog or cat can swim." Boswell, "They carve very ingeniously." Johnson, "A cat can scratch and a child with a nail can scratch." So Johnson was one who wasn't caught up in the idea of the noble savage, but many were. And you can see how the idea of the noble savage became influential in the way the explorers were seeing the new world, new lands. For instance, the French sent out a number of voyages through the Pacific, and they were exploring right around the continent at the time the British were. In fact, about 2 weeks after the first fleet landed in Botany Bay, La Perouse and his French expedition came into Botany Bay. So it was perhaps a very close thing that the Australian continent was owned by the British. Now, I think what these French voyages were doing were testing the ideas in Europe about the nature of mankind. Were the people in the Pacific savages? Were they noble or ignoble? So one of those expeditions was D'Entrecasteaux, and he came to the Australian region for two reasons. Firstly, to find La Perouse, because after La Perouse had left Sydney in 1788, after spending a few weeks there, he'd actually gone missing and was never found again, although I think some of the wrecks of his ship were found in the New Hebrides. And D'Entrecasteaux was to look for La Perouse, but also to further scientific knowledge. He had representatives of the learned societies of Paris on his ships, and they came, I think, in part to test the truth of Rousseau's ideas. Were these people to be savages, noble savages, or not? Was natural man fitter and more virtuous than urban man? And part of that voyage was, one man was Jean-Jacques Labillière. He was a botanist, part of the French landed gentry, and a Republican. And he'd written 3 major books on New Caledonia and Australia flora in his life. And he came trying to observe what was the nature of the Tasmanians. And he had many engaging encounters with them. He said that when he was walking down a hill at Adventure Bay, the Aboriginal people helped him get down, holding his hand, helping him get down there. He played the violin for them, and they were not very interested. And he said savages in general are not very sensible to the sounds of stringed instruments. So you can see he's testing all the time Rousseau's idea. But the women sing to him in their own language, and he says in great harmony. And so there's this exploration going on. One of the artists was this man called Piron, and perhaps you can't quite see it here, but it will be on WebCT for you to have a closer look at. But you can see here that Piron draws Aboriginal people of Tasmania in a sort of very Grecian manner. It looks a fine climate. They are living a life of leisure and ease, and their bodies are fit and healthy. And so Piron, the artist here, actually has engagements with Aboriginal people. He dances with them, he blackens his face with charcoal, and is helped to do so by the Aborigines. So there are real human engagements going on with these artists. With Bowden's expedition in 1802, I think there's a little bit of a tougher edge. And Bowden, I think, makes the transference during his voyage from a Rousseauian romanticism to a more harder-edged social evolutionary idea. He sees, I think, human history as part of lineal progress, and for him, Europe is the pinnacle of human development. He feels that he has little to learn from savages, except as a marker of his own progress. And of course, he was led to this view by the Anthropological Society back home in France, because the founder of the first French Anthropological Society that gave Bowden his orders as to what to look for when he's engaging with other people, Joseph Delgano said, "Through the investigations of the Bowden expedition, we shall in a way be taken back to the first periods of our own history. The philosophical traveller sailing to the ends of the earth is in fact travelling in time. He is exploring the past." So for the French Anthropological Association, Aboriginal people were not a different society, but a past society, a way that they could look at where European civilization had come from. But one of the scientists on that voyage, Perron, still clung to Rousseauian ideas that natural man was physically at least stronger. Even if he didn't have natural virtue and reason, he might be at least stronger than urban man. And so what they did, they took a thing called a dynameter, which was this sort of a machine, this apparatus that you had to press like this, and it registered the strength of the push. So they actually took a piece of equipment to test the strength of the savage. And I think what you're seeing here in this group of people is a slow disillusionment. First of all, they think that natural man has no edge on them in virtue, and then once they apply the dynameter, they find that the French sailors are actually stronger than the Aboriginal men that they tested on. And so you get Milius, one of the captains, the second in charge on the Naturalist, writing that the Aboriginal women he meets are ugly and unattractive, and he seems to abandon noble savagery. He writes, "The inhabitants of the west-northwest coast of New Holland, those of Donticastro Channel in Van Diemen's Land and on Maria Island, remind us again of the state of barbarism in which Europe was plunged before she was civilised. We have seen man wandering ceaselessly from shore to shore, through the woods, torch in hand, to obtain the means of subsistence, and fight for them perhaps with fierce animals, strangers to all rules of social living, knowing neither laws nor religion, and continually at war to seize women who appear to be condemned to the most arduous labours, who are often the victims of the tyrant's brutality. We always saw them occupied in fishing, whereas the men are stretched out before a fire to rest. Further proof that the strongest has always oppressed the weakest." So while the artists of the Bowden expedition still drew sensitive pictures, and here is a sensitive picture of a young boy, they were beginning in their journals to abandon the notion of the noble savage. English society also had this engagement with noble savagery, and it occurred with the visit of a man called Omai, who was a Tahitian noble. He was picked up on Cook's second voyage to the Pacific and asked, would he like to come back to England? And Omai, being a very amiable chap and full of self-confidence, said that he would do so. So he arrived back in London to a very wild and large reception, and he proceeded to be feted around London. He was given receptions by London ladies. He was presented to King George, where he received a sword from the king. He stepped back 3 paces. He bowed in the most gracious way and charmed everyone with the way in which he was able to pick up court behaviour. He was painted here by one of the great portrait painters of the day, Sir Joshua Reynolds, and here you see Sir Joshua Reynolds' rendering of him, which makes him look like a prince, perhaps a Bedouin prince, with great courtly manner and a noble brow, just like a gentleman. So that Reynolds was painting him as the noble savage. He had exquisite table manners when he went out to dinner. Miss Burnley wrote in her diary, Omai seems to shame education, but his manners are so extremely graceful and he is so polite, attentive and easy that you would have thought he came from some foreign court. And when Sir Joseph Banks held parties at which Omai was present, he thrilled everyone by swimming offshore further than any person had ever been, by grabbing hold of a horse he called a large hog and running along behind it holding its tail and managing with his dexterity not to be kicked to death by the horse. And so he was seen as the noble savage, and this was rendered in a play called Omai, which told the story of his coming to England, it told a story about him in the South Seas, and also the play ended with a eulogy to Cook, who by that stage was the great national hero. So Omai was able to play the role of the noble savage because he knew ceremonial life instinctively. That's what Tahitian society was all about, the acting out of performance and ceremony in courtly behaviour, of which he was a member of. And of course he was coming into an England who was willing to receive him as a noble savage, besotted by the romanticism of Tahiti and the South Seas. The second idea, apart from savagery, or noble savagery, that the Europeans had in their head, we might call social developmentalism. Bit of a mouthful. Just sort of rolls off if you let it. And this was the view that human societies were hierarchical and also linear in terms of their progress. Now this was a natural instinct for Europeans because they came from hierarchical societies, as I explained earlier, where the landed gentry were the ones who dominated political power and status through their ownership of land, and they in turn were under kings in Europe. And of course, to these hierarchical thinkers, we could see that they adopted very quickly the binary of primitive and civilised, of simple and advanced. We saw in the instructions to Bowden that he was told what he would be seeing was how Europe was in earlier times, perhaps 5,000 or 10,000 years before. So this is the way they instinctively thought. And last week I explained to you de Condorcet's typology in his book, A Sketch of the Progress of the Human Mind, in which he saw society as advancing from most simple forms of hunting and gathering to the most complex forms of industrial French society. And of course, the indicators for these people were technology and the arts, learning, the sciences, languages, plays, poetry, etc. These were all the markers of civilization. And this is how you told that one society was more advanced than another because it had advanced technology, weaponry, etc. And this was a way they thought of the whole world, not only about societies, indigenous societies in Europe, but even within Europe they thought of themselves as in different hierarchies. Like the French and the English were notorious on looking down on each other. The English thought the poor old French, they never got enough to eat, they didn't have good old English beef to bolster them, and they lived under the thrall of popery and Catholicism, and they weren't free men under the French king. And of course the French in turn looked upon the English as a bunch of barbarians who had no sense of culture. And of course, in a sense, that still underlies their feelings towards each other today, to a degree. So that this way of viewing the world was a very natural one, and they brought it to Australia and applied it. And then they didn't see Aboriginal society as perhaps different, as a very clever way to live in a difficult environment, but rather a primitive society that had to be uplifted. Now we know perhaps this is not the way the world should be, and we should just pause for a moment. What the Europeans were thinking about is what makes humans different. Why are we so advanced, they were thinking, when these people are so primitive? And they were thinking about this question. It's also Yarley's question too, because in his award-winning book, Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs and Steel, which is up on the slide there, published in 1997, he begins with his discussions of the world with a New Guinea man who he's met through his scientific research into bird life in New Guinea. And Yali asked him one night as they walked upon the beach, "Why do the Europeans have so much and why do we have so little?" And it was a penetrating question, and it was the question that the Europeans were asking themselves when they came. And Jared Diamond's brilliant book gives the answer that environment shapes human difference. And he starts off with a very interesting case study. As you'll probably know, the Pacific was peopled only about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. A very recent colonisation by Polynesian peoples throughout the Pacific, from the New Hebrides in the west way over to Easter Island in the far east. A very interesting migration story that was very recent and were very skillful with boats going long distances way out of sight of land. Now, Diamond tells a story of the Maori, some Maori men in about 1842 or 3, after Europeans had contacted New Zealand, had brought boats and also knowledge, because a lot of these Polynesian societies had lost contact with each other. Easter Island, if you read another interesting book called Collapse by Jared Diamond, Easter Island had become totally isolated from the Polynesian world. After years of trading, they'd become isolated, they'd chopped all their trees down and they couldn't even build a boat to get out of there. And so their population had gone from about 20,000 down to 2,000 by the time Europe found them. So that the Europeans come to New Zealand and tell the Maori about the Pacific and some of its other places. And so about 1843, the Maori got on board a ship and went to the Chatham Islands. Now, the Chatham Islands is a very small island, not very favoured environmentally, whereas New Zealand, as you know, is a place of quite considerable plenty, resources, whatever. So the Maori, 1,000 years ago, had developed a highly structured agricultural society with a warrior class, a specialised group, chiefs, etc. The Chatham Islanders had come to a very small and poor island, and they had remained hunters and gatherers with an egalitarian structure, no specialisation, no warrior class, etc. So what happened was the Maori got on board a boat in 1843, they travelled to the Chatham Islands, they had guns of course, and within 2 years they killed most of the Chatham Islanders. These people were the same people 1,000 years before. They'd come from the one source, the one migration. But in 1,000 years, a different environment had made a totally different social structure and a totally different attitude to solving problems, one a more aggressive one than the other. So I think that Jared Diamond gives that marvellous demonstration of the power of the environment to shape human difference. And that is the answer to Yali's question. And I'll just go on a little bit to explain some of the things he tells us which are very interesting about our world. He talks about this environmental favouritism. That's not his words, I think it's words that I created, but that's basically what it is. And the top map is one of the Mediterranean type zones in the world. Now, Mediterranean zones have mild, wet winters and long, hot summers. And they're to be found not only in the Mediterranean, but Southwest Australia, South Africa, Chile and California, for instance. They're Mediterranean climates. And so is the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East today, near Iran, Iraq. That was the Fertile Crescent. And it was here in the Fertile Crescent that food production first began about 7,000 years ago. Now, why was that so? Well, what Diamond shows is that the Fertile Crescent had a botanical edge. Firstly, most of the wild plants in that region were annual plants. And annuals have, because they have to grow up in a year and die again, they put a lot of energy into their heads, their seeds, and not much energy into their stems. So they produce crops with large amounts of edible seeds. Secondly, many of the world's productive wild seeds were found in this area, and they made domestication very easily. In fact, wild wheat and barley is very little different from domesticated wheat and barley. So there wasn't a big job for the locals to do to get some of these very productive and useful grains and start to domesticate them instead of just gathering them. And the other thing about the plants in this area is a lot of them are hermaphrodites. That is, they're self-seeding. And most wild plants are not self-seeding. So they also were easy to domesticate because they were easier to work with. So he's saying that the Fertile Crescent had a botanical edge on the other likely climates that were favourable to the growth of food production. The Fertile Crescent also had 5 other advantages, and just briefly. First of all, it was the largest area of Mediterranean climate, and this led to a wide plant diversity and gave humans in that area a lot to choose from when they wanted to consider food production. It also, because it's a large area, it had also a large climate variation. For instance, areas went from sea level to 18,000 feet in Tehran. So they had a great diversity of plant life because of the different altitudes, and they had a different growing season. So it was easier for hunters and gatherers to start to become seed gatherers because they could get seeds here that were maturing, and then over there that were maturing 2 weeks later, and seeds up here that were maturing a month later. So they had a much longer food supply of seeds and started to make a transition from hunting and gathering. The third one was a wide climatic variation as well, and a large percentage of annuals, as I said. One scientist has estimated that of the 56 best grasses in the world, the Fertile Crescent had 32 of them. Whereas you know how many Southwest Australia had? None. Not one of the best 56 grasses were found in Southwest Australia. The fourth thing was the Fertile Crescent had 4 important animals. They had the goat, the sheep, the pig and the cow. Now if you can think of the most important domesticated animals, there's only really one left, isn't there? The horse. So they didn't have the horse, but they had 4 of the 5 others. Do you know how many Southwest Australia had? You know the answer. None. So what we have is the Fertile Crescent being lucky. The people weren't smarter there, but they had a much easier climate to domesticate wild foods and to create food production. And the other thing that probably made it easier for them to make that switch was that there were fewer food animals in that area. Gazelles and things people have shown had by about 8,000 years ago largely been hunted out. So it was easier to make the shift to food production from hunting and gathering, whereas in Australia we know that in fact Aboriginal people were able to get food in a very easy way. Perhaps 4 to 5 hours of hunting and gathering a day would get all they needed. How much do we toil to get our day living? 35 hours to 60 hours a week we toil to get our daily living. So they had a life of fair comfort most of the time, and therefore there was no great incentive to move to food production. And of course there has to be incentive to do that, and the hunter and gatherer makes a big choice when they start to shift to food production, to growing seeds in enclosed plots, to putting a lot of effort into trying to grow a seed. And it can be a risky business. You develop into a monoculture like in the Irish famine and you see what happens. So it was a thing that probably took several thousand years to happen, and it was probably beginning in Australia, because we talked last week about the growth of eel farming in southwest Victoria, and of course Aboriginal people in western New South Wales used to gather wild grass seeds They didn't harvest them as such, but they would cut them and put them in a pile, like an English stook, and let the weather and the sun just make the seeds drop down into the centre, then they would gather them up. So they were beginning to be farmers. So the transition was there. So that really when the Europeans were talking about social developmentism, it was, I guess, a great prejudice that their society was the best, and for these reasons. And they were better because they were smarter, they were English. The other thing we can talk about is the meanings of colour people brought with them. Now the word black originally was swart in German. It came into the Old English, and then by the Middle English, ME became the word black. And during that time, it experienced a derogatory shift, because from meaning just a colour or absence of colour word in 12th century, by the 14th century the word black meant dirty, it meant evil, disgraceful, malignant, etc. So it had a language shift from a fairly neutral word about colour to one about values. And similarly the word wit, white, by the time of Middle English had suffered a shift which valorised that word, ennobled it, because it was no longer just about a colour, but it was about the notion of purity, of virtue, and innocence and fairness. And of course you can see this colour symbolism coming through in Shakespeare's great play, Othello, about the Moor, the black Moor, who falls in love with the fair Desdemona in a Italian city-state. He's the general of the armed forces, but their relationship, which is going well at first, is undermined by a man called Iago, who uses jealousies and fears and anxieties about difference and colour to undermine their pure relationship. And so Shakespeare was playing with the prevailing notions of blackness and whiteness. And of course you can see these coming through even in the Bible, the King James Version of the Bible of 1611, because Cain, who slews his brother Abel, the first murderer, is given a mark to show the shame and the punishment of God. And also Ham is cursed. Ham is the son of Noah, and he sees Noah drunk one night in the tent naked. Now to me that was Noah's problem, but poor old Ham, because he just happened to walk in on him and saw his father in this condition, he copped a curse, and he was punished and expelled for looking upon his father's shame. And in the Bible it came to be, and in religious circles, it came to be thought that the curse of Ham was actually the mark of blackness. So you can see how the colour symbolism is working. And of course it's very endemic. I went to primary school in Canterbury, where our Prime Minister went. I went to the same high school as him in the 1950s and 60s. And in the 1950s we had religious instruction classes. It was part of, it was a secular school system, but churches were allowed to send in someone 1 hour a week to instruct us. And we had a white-haired noble woman called Mrs. Cook, who used to come every week, and she had the audio-visual aids of the day rolled up, posters under her arm that are all patched up with sticky tape and whatever, and she'd unroll great works of art like Holman Hunt's Light of the World, and she'd show us these things and talk to us about Bible stories. And she also had some shapes. They were in the shape of a heart. She had two of them, and she had a black one and a white one. And she used to hold up the black one and she said, "Do you want to be like this, or do you want to be like this?" Well, what did we think? What did we say? Who wanted to be associated with the black heart of evilness? And so that colour symbolism is steeped still in our society to a degree. And this is what people came with in their heads. Now, this is not to say at the time it was that significant, because when Europe met Africa in the 15th century for the first time, as they started their sea explorations to reach the east, they of course met African societies, and they speculated on their skin and their hair. Why were these people black? Was it because they lived closer to the sun than Europeans? Or was it some sort of, protection against the sun? Or was it the mark of Ham? Was it the curse of Ham of blackness? And so they pondered this, and yet at the same time they still emphasised their savagery. They did not see blackness as particularly significant. They emphasised that they were savages, and they emphasised even more that they were heathens, because the Europeans of this day were very much in an age of faith, and they saw the world in religious terms, so it was the heathenism of the Africans which was the most important, not their blackness. But of course this idea, I think, later shifted, and possibly I think it's during the time of the Atlantic slave trade in the 18th and 19th century that the notions of blackness came to have more significance for Europeans because of a need to justify the slave trade. And you can, no, I'll go back, except I don't know how to go back. How do I go back? Yep. The other thing is that Horseman has talked about the notion of Anglo-Saxonism and reminded us that when the English thought of themselves as Anglo-Saxons in the 18th century, they didn't give it a racial turn, but rather a cultural one. Anglo-Saxons were people who were defenders of parliamentary democracy, or at least the rights of Parliament, and they traced back their origins to the Magna Carta. They didn't see themselves as Anglo-Saxon, as white people, but rather as defenders of a view of the world constitutionally. And it was only later in the mid-19th century that they started to talk about themselves as descendants of the pure Teutonic tribes and to give it more a racial emphasis. I think the fourth thing that the Europeans came with was the Enlightenment thinking. And here we have the new ideas of Francis Bacon, for instance, in his great work Novum Organum, which was to bring together all the knowledge of the world in 4 or 5 volumes. He introduced scientific method, that you had to work from observation and then you could build up general principles from case studies. And he was also echoed by René Descartes, the French philosopher, mathematician, who thought about the nature of the world and knowledge, and was the first one to come up with this sort of atomic idea that everything was made up of small particles that were similar. He called them corpuscles. So he had a very sort of mechanical view of the world and how it operated. He was also a very religious man, and his great dictum was, "I think, therefore I am," which meant that he said that God was the supporter of rational thought. Rational thought was not secular, but it was given by God, and God would not trick people. So if they thought about the world rationally and scientifically, they would understand the world. And it was these men and the organisations like the Royal Society, formed in 1660, that led to a massive explosion in the scientific world and a rage to classify everything. The thing about the English Royal Society was that its language was not the previous language of Latin, the language of science, but it made a decision to talk in English, to write in English. And so people all over the country start sending in observational data of things they've seen in the natural world, and this an incredible rage to classify things. And here you see in the image, it's René Descartes showing Queen Christina of Sweden. Every afternoon he gave her science lessons while he stayed in Sweden for several months. At 5 o'clock he would talk science to her, and she was interested. So the European mind is opening up to the scientific world. And of course this led on to racial classification. People started to classify all manner of living things, birds, animals, plants, and they also started to think about the different human groups and why they might have been different. Skulls were measured, bodies, arms, etc. are being measured to make ideas about human difference. And there was the beginning of the idea of different races. Some people said there were 4 different races, others said there were 5, some said there were 3, all of which goes to show that these were social constructions in their mind about race. And as I said, even the notion of Anglo-Saxonism becomes to take on racial characteristics and things by the 19th century, but not earlier. The last idea that perhaps is important to think about, people coming to Australia, was they had a notion of the rights of Englishmen. And there was actually a very interesting debate. Just as the First Fleet was about to leave England, there was a debate amongst the educated people of London about the convict decision. And particularly they thought about the Aboriginal issue, which might surprise us, but they did give it thought in London. And they wondered whether it was right that the British should put a bunch of convicts in the middle of an Indigenous population. They showed concern about the violent implications of that possibly, or the immorality that was going to be lobbed down into the midst of Aboriginal people. And they also discussed the idea of a treaty. So even though we were saying last week that there was no treaty offered, in London at least they did discuss whether there should be a treaty with these Aboriginal people. And so underpinning the whole debate that was going on was that Aboriginal people would become British subjects with the creation of a colony, and those British subjects had certain rights. And certainly at the time, the ordinary Englishman and particularly man rather than woman had rights. They had the right not to suffer tyranny at the hands of even the king. There was a law habeas corpus, which meant you could not be held without trial for more than a very short time. There was a protection of people's property and also their person under the law. These were the rights of all people. And Englishmen had the rights of petition, the right to protest and riot, and to make their feelings known. So it's interesting that there's a bit of policy confusion going on here, because Aboriginal people were seen as both subjects of the Crown with certain rights, that they would have certain rights, but also they were being dispossessed of their land at the very same time. But it's interesting that the coercive nature of the settlers doesn't come to the fore for about 50 years. When the British government is in control of European settlement in Australia, they're not coercive. It's only when the settlers get into control after responsible government that they start to bring in Aboriginal acts that have the right to move people around or to remove their children legally under the law. Not to say they didn't move people around before that and children were taken, but it wasn't a statute of the land that they could do so. So we can see that the cultural baggage that I've been talking about is complex, and it certainly would differ from individual to individual and perhaps from social rank to social rank, and maybe with the education of the settler. The upper educated elite tended to be the ones who believed more in noble savagery, and we are reading What Can Tench today in our tutorial, and we'll have that to discuss about Tench. The lower orders perhaps believed more in the ignoble savage. Thomas Watling, the convict artist, was someone who held quite hard views towards Aboriginal people. And we do have some of his words. He wrote a letter back to his mother saying he resented Governor Phillip, who protected the Aborigines and said they were not at fault in the clashes and it was the convicts' fault. And he said rather that they were marked by ferocity, cunning, treachery, filth and immodesty are strikingly their dark characteristics. Now, do these ideas shift over time? So I just want to show you some images now of Aboriginal people to see that perhaps over time images change towards Aboriginal people of early Sydney. Now, this was published in Phillip's account of his voyages in 1793, and here you see a very Grecian scene of a romanticised savage living in plenty, getting their food with great ease. They are healthy, they're fit, they're strong-bodied, and not particularly like perhaps the Aboriginal stature was, but they were seen through the gloss of an ancient Greek statuary. This was Thomas Watling, the convict artist, who was quite a different rendering of it. It was more ethnographic, perhaps true in a way. It wasn't romanticised, but at that stage it's not particularly derogatory. We have a family cooking some fish, children are playing on the rocks, and they're engaging in family life. So it's quite a sympathetic portrait of them in many ways. Also, we have the Port Jackson painter, another convict artist, painted this portrait of an Aboriginal man. And again, it's a fairly ethnographic, perhaps even rendering of the person. He's interested in his scarification on his back and getting the hair right, etc. So there's not particularly great value judgments, I think, loaded in that portrait. And here you can see how romanticism can take hold. On the left, we have a sketch of the native family of New South Wales, drawn by Philip Gidley King, one of the officers of the First Fleet, who later becomes governor in about 1802. And he draws this picture of a family with their fishing equipment. Now that picture gets taken to London and gets into the hands of an engraver, and that engraver is none other than William Blake, the great philosopher, poet and religious artist of the day. And he was also a romantic. William Blake actually went out to live in the countryside amongst the rustic peasantry and thought he was going to have a wonderful life until he found it was cold and damp and they weren't very interesting to talk to, so he skulked back to London. But he was a romantic looking back on noble savagery, so you can see what he does to this image. He makes it more noble, a bit more patriarchal perhaps, and they are, you know, fit, strong and admirable people. By 1819, you're getting R. Brown painting these people around Sydney, and he's choosing to paint them in caricature. And a very unsympathetic portraiture. He chooses a woman that apparently had disability. She was called Humpback Maria around the settlement. He chose to render her, and also McGill in a fairly, you know, alien, I guess, stance. Augustus Earle drew this, Natives of New South Wales, as seen in the streets of Sydney, where he very clearly posed the savage against civilisation and showed this remnant community on the edge of the glorious growing new settler society with its two-storey houses and its ladies in their fine clothing and Aboriginal people desperate. There's bottles, they're cooking in some sort of communal pot here and they're fairly dishevelled. Charles Rodius painted this, the streets of Sydney, which is a very violent, ugly, aggressive version of the savagery that he believed he saw in the streets of Sydney. A very, you know, strong image throughout Australian history of alcohol abuse and violence in Aboriginal society and the lack of care for Aboriginal children. So this is a very stereotypical view, and this is coming in by the 1820s. And yet, you know, you can see both those two artists I've shown could render other things. Here are both very sympathetic, perhaps pathetic, pictures of an Aboriginal man and a traditional woman, but very sympathetic, seeing them as human, not caricaturing them in any way. So it was possible for these artists to see things in both veins. So I think you're getting a shift, and I guess this is happening across the world as Europe is starting off with that idea of noble savagery, and then it's starting to get broken down for various reasons. Here you have Piron, which I showed you before, of that sort of Arcadian view of Aboriginal society, a society of plenty where people are just bathing with great pleasure in healthy and fit bodies, family life. There's great beauty and grace in those people. And then in the mid-1820s, another French artist at St George's Sound, where I talked to you last week about the community there, but this was drawn by L.A. de Sanson, King George's Sound, and here you have the wretched savage drawn by Sanson. They are ragged, they are in grotesque body poses. They are being shown a mirror and being absolutely quite amazed about it all. You know, it's the superior showing the savage the mirror, and wow, look at the response you get. And so you can see that there's been this incredible shift in the European imaginings of Indigenous people in this 20 to 30 years. So Europeans then are making knowledge, very powerful knowledge about things. And we've got to remember, when we see these images, we've got to deconstruct them, because we don't take them at face value. We have to look at the things that have gone into their making and explain it. That's the only reason why we should be looking at them. And when we read accounts from the past, we need to look at them closely and to see what went into their making. You can see here Indigenous people are being increasingly defined as an ignoble other. And so the Eora people of coastal Sydney are being described as natives, as Aborigines, as also savages, and not as Eora. So they're being defined by the outsider, defined by the colonisers. And that's, of course, what Bain Attwood has called Aboriginalism. So why did the representation shift from noble to ignoble savage? Well, I think there's probably two main reasons. The first one we could call justifying dispossession. And there's a very interesting book written by Albert Memmi in 1967 called The Coloniser and the Colonised. Albert Memmi was a Tunisian who experienced French colonialism and who wrote about the colonial condition, and in a very interesting way, because he didn't talk about colonialism as a material creation so much as a psychological one, and that colonialism creates psychological pressures in both parties, that the settler becomes the coloniser and the Indigenous people become the colonised. So both are transformed and changed by colonialism and its expectations and pressures. And Memmi stressed what he called the usurper complex. You know what a usurper is, someone who comes in and takes things of someone else, their land or their power or their place. So he talked about the usurper complex, and it's interesting to use the word complex because, again, the emphasis being put on psychological aspects of colonialism. And he says what the usurper complex does is to create two portraits. And you might use the word stereotypes as well, two portraits. And those portraits, one of them is of the settlers, the coloniser, and that portrait is of a noble people with a noble culture coming in to do noble things in this area. And the other portrait is, of course, of the Indigenous people, the colonised, and the portrait of them is that they are a lesser people, perhaps even not even people, that they are savage, and therefore they do not have the rights to own this place. So that it's a great justification, and it of course leads to the rise of the denigration of the Indigenous people. So this is one of the explanations of that shift from a benign image of them, or even a romanticised image of them, to one of great denigration. I think the second reason is what's happening in the struggle between two peoples. What's happening on the frontier led to the demonising of the enemy. Now, in early Sydney, you might be gathering from the reading you're doing that the settlement was fairly peaceful, and it was at first. And most European beachheads were peaceful. Early Melbourne was fairly peaceful. I think it's a numbers issue. Remember that 1,000 people arrived on the shores of Port Jackson, so very quickly the locals are matched in numbers, if not outnumbered. So there is restraint on both sides, but I think it's not only because they feel intimidated and outnumbered, but there's an attempt on both sides to get along. We know that Philip came with the instructions to treat Aboriginal people with amity, friendship and kindness. And there was real efforts, I think, at first to do so. And Aboriginal people also treated the Europeans in a restrained, kindly manner. Philip himself, as you'll see, and I'm going to show a video soon, about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, Philip himself is speared in the shoulder, almost dies. Another half an inch one way and it would have severed an artery. He would have been dead. He was tolerant about that attack and took no grudge against Aboriginal people. So there's a great deal of goodwill on both sides at first. And the people who actually start the first violence, as I've shown, was La Perouse. La Perouse was only here for a few weeks and he actually managed to shoot at a group of Aboriginal people, kill a few. He had some violent incidences in the Pacific, and I think that was the way he was dealing with trouble. And when he arrived at Botany Bay, he immediately built a fortress just for his temporary camp, a palisade. The British did not do that. So there was initial French violence, and then after that there were mainly individual skirmishes with casualties and with deaths in those first year or two. But when there was an increasing competition over resources and land, I think that's when trouble quickly arose. At Prospect Hill in 1791, 12 convicts were given land by the governor, or ex-convicts, they'd served their time. This is just west of Parramatta, probably 40 kilometres east of Sydney. And when the convicts were given land, a large number of Aboriginal people gathered and ended up attacking the convicts and firing their huts. Troops were sent in to disperse the Aboriginal people, and disperse was a euphemism for shooting at, pushing off by force. And then Philip ordered all the ground in the area to be cleared to get rid of the bush around the farms so that there would be no cover for the farmers to be attacked. In the mid-1790s, the Hawkesbury River became the place of considerable trouble. And this is, of course, the scene of the recent novel by Kate Grenfell, Secret River, which has won quite a number of awards and much acclaim. So the Hawkesbury was, of course, the breadbasket of early Sydney because it was the area where the river often flooded over the river flats and there were very fertile plains. So it was the breadbasket of the colony. It was also the home of the Daru people. And so very quickly trouble emerged. And there was a significant number of deaths. The troops were sent up from Sydney. They were told to fire upon Aboriginal people they saw, and if they killed anyone, their bodies were to be placed in gibbets and put on display to other Aboriginal people as a warning. And this was a very usual thing in European military occupations. They put bodies up to show their reign of violence that could occur if more trouble happened. So there are significant incidences up on the Hawkesbury River, and there's a great alarm in Sydney. The troops are sent up a number of times. The orders are given to fire upon these people, so the myth of them being equal British subjects is dispatched with, and it's seen to be a state of warfare. And Aboriginal people develop new tactics of economic warfare, which they'd never practiced before in their traditional fighting with other Aboriginal groups. And one of those was the theft of corn and they raided, often in numbers of 30 to 50 people would raid a farmer's cornfield. The farmer was unable to do anything against such a large group, and they stripped the cornfield bare, carted away huge amounts of corn cobs, and then ate them at their leisure, and were able to still act against the Europeans. So it was a very good food supply to enable them to keep a warfare going. Also, land was fired and they burnt the crops. They didn't try to eat wheat crops because they had to process it. So they just burnt them, and there was great fear and anxiety amongst the Europeans about the burning of their crops, and also the firing of their farmhouses, or theft from farmhouses. So that there is a significant warfare. There's a couple of leaders, Pemulwuy and his son Tedbury, are seen to be warrior leaders by the Europeans. They're known, and they eventually both are captured. So there's significant anxiety, and that then develops in the Nepean district, a bit further west of Sydney, in 1814-16. Again, British troops are brought in, and they don't do very well because they're running around the bush that they don't know. They've got heavy equipment and very heavy guns, and they can never quite keep up with the warriors they're chasing. So eventually one group is cornered, and there are about a dozen deaths in that action, and that eventually brings peace. But I think that that those two things, the frontier war that does develop over resources, is one of the main reasons why you get a shift in the attitude to Aboriginal people, and of course the justification for taking possession of the place. So I've put some further reading there. This will be up on WebCT, and you can look at it at leisure and some of those things if you wish to. We'll take a break now, and I just want to